Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajim. Bismillahir-rahmanir-rahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yesterday we have discussed the sporogenous tissue and microsporogenesis. Today we will take up the structure and development of pollen grain or male gametophyte. Each pollen grain is a haploid unicellular mass of protoplasm with a single nucleus. And each pollen grain which represents the male gamete, even male gametophyte, is haploid unicellular mass of protoplasm with a single nucleus. Its shape varies from oval to polyhedral, and its shape varies from oval to polyhedral. It is of different shapes. Its shape varies from oval to polyhedral, and externally this pollen grain, it is covered by a two-layered cell wall. The outer wall is thick cuticularized, thick tough and cuticularized with spinous outgrowths. Outer layer is thick, tough, cuticularized with spinous outgrowths. These are the spines called axene. It is made up of, this axene is made up of a complex substance called sporopollen, which is the most resistant chemical substance, complex substance, which makes these pollen grains resistant. But at certain places, this axene is thin or missing. Axene is thin or missing, and generally it is thick. Mostly it is thick and tough, but at certain places it is thin and missing, giving the appearance of a pore. This pore is called a germ pore. And generally this axene is thick, but at certain places it is thin or missing, giving the appearance of a pore called germ pore. And there are generally 3 germ pores in dicots and only 1 germ pore in monocots. And in dicots we have generally 3 germ pores, but in monocots we have only 1 germ pore. The inner layer that is intine, it is generally thin. It is generally thin and uniform. It is made up of pectocellulose. It is made up of pectocellulose. And at the time of germination, pollen tube comes out of the germ tube. This actually it is intine, which comes out of the germ pore in the form of a pollen tube. And at the time of germination, when pollen grain swells, it's intine. It comes out through the missing portion or through the thin portion, that is germ pore, and comes out in the form of a pollen tube. In insect pollinated flowers, this axene, it is covered by a yellow. It is covered externally by a yellow, viscous, yellow viscous and sticky substance called pollen kit, which helps in pollination, due to its sticky nature. And when insects they land on the flower, this pollen grain, it gets sticked to the mouth of the insects due to its sticky nature, and when they land on a female flower, it reaches to the female flower, and thus pollination takes place. This is the structure of pollen grain. Now, development of pollen grain or male gametophyte. Pollen grain is the first cell of the male gametophyte. Is the pollen grain. The pollen grain is the first cell of the male gametophyte. The development of the male gametophyte, that is pollen grain, it begins in the anther. It starts while it is within the anther. That is called precocious development. Precocious development of pollen grain or male gametophyte. That is, it begins while it is within the anther. The freshly formed microspore or pollen grain has rich cytoplasm. The freshly formed pollen grain or microspore, it has a rich cytoplasm with a centrally located nucleus, with a centrally placed prominent nucleus. But prior to this first division, this nucleus, it is displaced towards the periphery due to the formation of a big central vacuole. And prior to first mitotic division, the nucleus of the microspore or pollen grain, it becomes displaced to the peripheral position due to the formation of a large central vacuole. Now the protoplast of this pollen grain microspore, it divides unequally. When nucleus is displaced, it divides unequally to form a larger tube cell and a smaller generative cell. And it divides unequally to produce a larger tube cell, which is also called a vegetative cell, and a smaller generative cell. The first cell, that is the larger tube cell, it does not divide any further. But the later, that is generative cell, it divides further to give rise to two male gametes. And vegetative or the tube cell, it does not divide any further. But the later, that is the gametic cell or the generative cell, it divides further to give rise to two male gametes or two male nuclei. This second division of the generative cell, it either occurs in the pollen grain before pollination or after pollination. And if it takes place before the pollination, that is on the anther, the pollen grain shuts at 3-celled stage. And if it takes place after pollination, that is on the stigma, after pollen grain lands on the stigma, then it shuts only at 2-celled stage. And a 3-celled stage means one tube cell plus 2 male gametes. Here two-celled stage means one tube cell plus one generative nucleus. Generative nucleus. Now during the pollination, whether it is two cell or three stages, ultimately it lands on the stigma. It lands on the stigma of a female flower or stigma of a carpel of the same flower or another flower, that is on the female reproductive organ. What happens here? This pollen grain, it absorbs water and minerals from the stigma, and this, due to this absorption, it swells. It swells. When it swells, it ruptures at the axine, it ruptures at the germ pore. It ruptures, and this intine comes out through the germ pore. Intine comes out through this germ pore in the form of a tube that is called a pollen tube. And this pollen tube, it is the extension of, actually it is produced by the tube cell. That's why we call it tube cell. It produces pollen tube, and it produces a vegetative part, that is the pollen tube, which is the vegetative part. That's why we call it vegetative cell or the tube cell. And it grows out through the germ pore to form a cylinder pollen tube. The pollen tube, the tip of the pollen tube, it secretes pectinases and cellulases, two enzymes, pectinases and cellulases. These pectinases and cellulases, what they do, they make a passage through the style into the ovule, and it has to pass through the style. Style is made up of pectin and cellulose. When it's released, secretes these enzymes, pectinases, cellulases, and these are also hydrolytic enzymes. It makes passage, it makes way into the ovule, where it releases two male gametes. These two male gametes then fuses with the female gametophyte to produce two different structures. One male gamete produces the zygote, and another male gamete fuses with the central diploid cell there and produces the primary endosperm nucleus. This is all about the development of male gametophyte or pollen grain. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.